Okay, let's transition a little bit into the investor, real estate, basically owner, landlord, tenant, and we'll probably dig into the contractor situation too, just because investors deal with contractors percentage-wise much more often than homeowners do.
Yeah, makes sense.
So how did you find yourself in the niche of helping investors in the real estate attorney world?
I was a real estate investor. I dabbled in having some rental property and thought that would be my growth path. My brother got me interested in it. He's younger than I am, and he thought that real estate was the way to go. He loves the bigger pockets guys. I don't know if you've heard of them. Yeah, okay.
Oh yeah, I started on Bigger Pockets when I lost my my first W-2 job, and I decided that never again am I going to rely on one paycheck. That's when I started researching investment, real estate, and Bigger Pockets. I landed there, and I've been a very solid Des Moines contributor since. Changed my life, no question.
So they do. I like what they do a lot. So if someone's wanting to dabble, I strongly suggest starting out there because the tools for calculating profitability and such are just amazing. And I know a lot of people who just dive in feet first and then mess up. Some people think, oh, I don't have to be cash flow positive. I'll just make it up when I sell my house. And sure, okay, you want to do it that way, fine. But being cash flow positive sure is nice.
Yeah.
So
it becomes not an expense.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, because we all some people buy cars and you have a $200-300 car payment. And when you have a non-cash flowing property, it's like that $200 or $300 car payment, it can be fine as a house because of the potential of appreciation.
Right.
Cars are not that quite same way because they don't really appreciate, at least most of them don't. But yeah, you can still win in the real estate without cash flow. It's just a much different investment than cash flowing real estate.
I strongly suggest if you have the choice, go cash flow positive. That said, I do know some people who like to have very cautious investments. They would rather buy a $250,000 house that targets a certain type of demographic than a $110,000 house that targets a different one. And sure, that's a choice. But being informed about it is smart. So that's why I do like the Bigger Pockets tools. So I dabbled in real estate investing. I actually sold our big house and moved into a little tiny fixer-upper. And the family made it a family project. We fixed it up and sold it. And so, I understand real estate investing. Right before the pandemic, I decided I had this terrible tenant. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to tell you names, but you can Google his name, and Iowa has basically started making new laws because of this person.
Wow.
Yeah, it's real interesting.
So Iowa doesn't have as many of these types of tenants. From my understanding, in California, they're literally called professional tenants.
That's not quite what we're talking about here, but I will just say that this person was scamming a lot of people. He was very persuasive. He convinced me that I decided I did not want to be a real estate investor. I had too much going on in my life, and so I cashed out. And I literally sold that house. I believe it was February of 2020. And right when we were going through the closing, we were like, what do you think this COVID thing is going to do? Is this going to be a big deal or not? I mean, that's what we were talking about. And then shortly after closing, I thought, oh, I am glad I got out when I did.
Yeah.
And I put my money into REITs, and so I stopped investing in the way that a lot of people think of, but I was still a real estate investor.
Yep.
And so because of that, when I started to practice, I used my experience. I thought I can connect with these people because I know the kinds of things that they think about. And my real estate investing was on a small scale, but there's a lot of people who just have 2 or 3 or 4 houses. And that's part of their retirement plan or whatnot, their diversification. And then of course there's a lot of people that have a dozen or 100 units that they rent, and I help them too.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's the most common misconception that to be a real estate investor, you need to have hundreds of units. Mm-hmm. I think if you have a 401k and you have a substantial amount of money in it, I think a good asset diversification, prudent, would be buying a rental property.
Not a bad idea, really.
Putting the right people in place to make sure you buy it correctly, but it's just a different type of asset.
Mm-hmm. So. Yep. And it doesn't move up and down in the same way that the stock market does. And so when one is up, the other one can be down, and vice versa. And real estate doesn't, in Iowa at least, hasn't really gone down like the stock market has. But even if it slows down, it tends to do it at a different way than the stock market does. So the diversification aspect is a good idea.
And I'm in some things I'm very impulsive, right? And so when I see the stock going up and down, I will literally go out to eat at nicer restaurants when the stock is up than when it's down. I'm telling my wife, hey, we're eating peanut butter and jelly. Like it's in my heart and how I think. So real estate has been a godsend for that, of just like, we'll just, do the same thing. We don't need to, there's not that fluctuation. Probably my wife appreciates that. So that's something that I valued in it, as opposed to the ups and downs of stock market.
No, I hear you. And actually it was real exciting for me because when I decided to start my own law firm, to go solo, to be an entrepreneur again, I had my emergency fund in the market, invested in at various different levels of risk. And so I knew that I needed, my plan was 6 months of income to live off of. And so I was watching the stock market go up and down. And it was the summer of 2020 when, the market was going up at a pretty good rate. It was really nice. I thank God for this, but I was able to stretch out my runway to about a year, because that's about how long it took for my practice to really support my family.
That's awesome.
And yeah, it was great. So yeah, I know what you mean about the emotional aspect of how the market influences us when we're invested in it.
Yeah. So real estate, what's your most common question that you get from real estate investors that have not bought, that are worried about tenants, or questions about how to be a landlord, I guess?
Yeah, sure. Well, so a lot of people understand that my specialty is in understanding and managing risk. So that's what I help small businesses do. And real estate investors are small businesses. So don't make any mistake. If you are running a rental property empire, you're a business, and it may not feel like it because you might still have a job at Pioneer or wherever that you do during the day, and then you manage these investments on the side. It's still a side gig. It's a business. So usually when they come to me, we're talking about risk management. What happens if a tenant slips and falls and injures himself? What happens if a tenant doesn't pay the rent? What happens if the tenant loses their job? What happens if there's a terrible remodeling gone wrong or something like that? I usually help people manage risks. The LLC is probably one of the greatest tools that I love for real estate investors, because it lets us put a wall between an investor's personal assets, their 401k or their boats that they play with on the weekends, and their business's assets, which would be their real estate or whatever's over here. And I really like to talk about how this LLC wall can keep problems from coming from the business side over to the personal side, and to keep that separation. So that is the area that we tend to talk about the most, is how to keep that LLC wall nice and strong.
Okay, so let's dig into that, because that is one, like when I'm talking to new investors, they're like, what's the first step I should do? And LLC is always in the room. And so tell me where I'm wrong. I struggle to say that's the first thing.
Nope, I don't say that either.
Okay, perfect. Because in my mind, usually you're getting a bank loan. And if you're going to do it the most efficient way, you're going to get a residential investor loan that has the lowest interest rate and can do a 30-year fixed. And usually the banks are not going to loan that out to an LLC. It's going to be to your personal name. So you have to buy it in your personal name anyway.
Yep.
Where does the LLC come into play there then?
Well, I'll just tell you that in my risk strategies, I put an LLC as number 2. And so even if we were only just taking your question and just say, let's just talk about how to manage risk, I don't even put LLC as the number one way to do that. A good insurance agent is the number one way to manage your risk. And so if you decided, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to go buy a house and I'm going to get my insurance agent to insure it, whatever, you're probably going to be covered for most problems. That's your biggest risk mitigation. However, as you start to pay off that house, you're going to build up an asset. And we'll go on to number 2 for the LLC. But that doesn't answer your specific question. I'm sure we can get to that. I agree. Buying the house in your personal name for your first couple houses is going to be a necessity, because your business doesn't have debt or assets to cover it. And so what we do is we wait for the title, the deed and the mortgage to clear and to get recorded. And then we transfer the property from the person to the business using a quitclaim deed or a warranty deed if we want to. And that allows the bank to have what they're happy with. People say, well, I read this mortgage, and who does that, right? But they do.
Your software engineer friends that you used to work with do, I promise.
Okay. Yeah, well, I do see some people who are pretty geeky about this kind of thing. And they say, it says here that if I transfer it to my LLC, that I'll have to pay the mortgage off immediately. They call it a due on transfer clause. And that is technically true. We say to people, what do the banks want? They want you to make your payment every month. Keep doing that. Don't tell them you're transferring. They don't care. They really don't. And it doesn't matter if you're transferring it into an LLC or a corporation or even your trust. If you want to put it in your trust so that your heirs can have a simpler time when they need to deal with your final affairs, that's fine too. The banks, they really don't care. If you stop paying, they care. But if you just let everything settle, let the documents clear 2 or 3 months, then you can transfer it to the LLC. But you know what? Even if you did that, you don't have to transfer it into the LLC. We also will sometimes leave the property in the person's name for whatever reason, and then we let the LLC manage the property. And that's a fine strategy too. The only thing is that the owner of the LLC needs to be also the owner of the house. Because if you hire someone else to manage your property, they need to be a licensed realtor.
I mentioned that to people and they're like, who tracks that? And I'm like, I don't know anyone that tracks it. Are you familiar with like, is there, and we can get into that question another time.
But I'm assuming that your ethics board or your regulating board has a unauthorized practice committee that if somebody complains, then they'll go after them. And
That's probably true.
Yeah.
I should look into that. I laugh at it because I do every Friday morning, we do a coffee meetup, which if you're ever bored on a Friday morning, you should join us. You'd have a lot of good insight for everyone. And I don't know. But everyone's like, I'd love to get into real estate. I can't buy right now, but I'd love to manage someone else's property. And I'm like, there's a right and a wrong way to do that. And I'm not the guy, but I know that you need to figure that out. So
I can probably help somebody make a plan to do that.
Okay, cool.
So it's not an insurmountable issue, but I did look into the laws, and the owner of the LLC needs to be the owner of the property to stay high and dry. But can the owner delegate some things to another person? Could be.
Right. That's why I always thought, I was like, I feel like there's a fine line there and it could be pushed if you wanted to. But that, I go back to like, if someone's starting in real estate and they literally have no money, how do you get experience in this without just literally reading all of Bigger Pockets and listening to all the podcasts? I'm like, go do something, go work for free for a real estate investor and figure out what their problem is. And most investors, their problem is hiring help, whether it's contracting, property management. Finding a deal is a whole different story, but in the actual management of the investment. So
yeah, and I work with investors outside of the Des Moines metro, and it's worse there. The number of companies who are doing property management outside of the metro, tiny list. It's tricky.
When someone comes to me from out of state or in state and says, I want to invest in small town, even if it's not that small, say Marshalltown, which cash flows crazy good because you can buy a property for $60,000 and rent it for $700, $800 a month all day long. But the property management options you have there are so limited and or non-existent that very few property managers from Des Moines will drive up there. And so it's the same way with most of the small towns outside of 40-minute drive from Des Moines. And I used to own property in Fairfield, Iowa, which was 2 hours southeast of Des Moines. And again, it cash flowed like crazy. Like beyond crazy. But I had to self-manage from here.
Yeah, that'd be tough.
It was really tough. I ended up selling them late last year. So, okay, back to investors, real estate. What else, man?
We were talking about LLCs a little bit, and so should we dig into that? What questions about LLCs do you have?
How about partnerships with the LLC world?
Sure.
Because in my world, a lot of people get frightened doing things themselves, and so they always want to partner with someone else. And so, how do you partner on purchasing a property, setting up an LLC, setting up an operations agreement? Like what do you have insight or input on that?
I'm just going to say that anytime that you think about saying the word partnership, I strongly suggest having a lawyer involved. I really cannot emphasize this enough because there is such a thing as an accidental partnership that happens so easily. And accidental partnerships are the exact opposite of limited liability companies. An accidental partnership gives 100% liability to all the partners. So partner A and partner B accidentally make a partnership. Partner A decides to go buy, $100,000 mini excavator, and then partner B is on the hook for it, and they didn't even know about it. And you have unlimited liability. And unlimited sounds good, like unlimited minutes on your phone or unlimited data on your Wi-Fi. No, we do not want unlimited liability. We want limited liability. So with partnerships, it's worth talking to a lawyer for 30 minutes or 45 minutes to make sure we do it right. I use LLCs as my tool of choice for partnerships because you can bend and shape an LLC to almost any shape, kind of like those balloon guys at the fair. And you can take a partnership and achieve everything that you want with an LLC and get the benefits what you might have through any kind of old-fashioned partnership, and also keep the limited liability nature. And this is probably worth mentioning, which is not exactly an answer to your question. And if I was in the other room, I could show you a law book, but the law on corporations is fat. The law on LLCs is like 40 pages. It's not very much. Most of LLC rules are dictated by a contract. And so the LLC law basically just handles some default things, and anything that you really want to do with your LLC, you override those things with what we call an operating agreement. And a lot of DIY people will go file an LLC for $50 on the state of Iowa website, but they won't have an operating agreement. And so all they get is these default rules. They don't get the maximum protection that an operating agreement creates. But that operating agreement, since it's a contract, it can be written to say a ton of different things. So for example, A is putting in most of the money, B is putting in sweat equity. We want to make sure that A gets some immediate return on investment, that B's value in the LLC goes up over time until they're equal partners, and then they get just, whatever. We can get all kinds of fancy rules in there with this operating agreement. And you can do it with a partnership agreement as well. But if you only use a partnership, you can't get the full unlimited, you can't get the full limited liability that an LLC provides.
So basically what you're saying is, I guess I didn't realize a partnership is different than an LLC with an operation agreement. Interesting.
If you register your partnership, and I'm putting quotes around that, as an LLC, then it is an LLC, right? That's what it is. And so I do have some of these bigger investors who come to me and they say they call it a limited partnership. And I say, just to double check, we're doing an LLC, right? And they say yes, and that's fine. So they're just using old-fashioned terminology and they're using a new modern tool. And LLCs are pretty modern. They've only been around since the 70s. So, they're kind of newfangled things.
Compared to property law.
Yeah, right. And corporation law. Corporation law has been around since the first ship set off for the Americas. So
cool. Okay, so LLCs, and the key is LLCs are just, they're basically covering, and then you have the operating agreement that tells essentially what the actual details are.
Yeah.
Of the two people working in business together.
Yeah. So what we might do is we might set some rules. For example, see, here's the funny thing about LLCs. They have funny names. So the owners of an LLC, if you were the owner of some Tesla stock, then you would be a shareholder, and you would be one of the owners of the company, right? And if you are one of the owners of an LLC, you're not called a shareholder, you're called a member, which is kind of a funny name. But usually what we do is we set it up so that the members can vote on really important things, kind of like the Tesla shareholders. But most of the work that's being done is being done by delegated people, the managers, which would be like the CEO of a company. But guess what? It's often the same people, right? The owners, the members are also the managers running the business. But what we might do is set up rules that any manager can make a decision. This manager can spend, $10,000, but if they want to spend $10,001, then it has to be voted on by everybody. So we'll set up rules so the partners know what their limits are. Cool. And sometimes we do a much lower amount as well.
I would imagine because of the complexity here, you have a couple canned, like, this is best practice, this is for, one person's bringing the money, one person's going to do the work. Like, you have some like generalities so that two people could come to you and say, this is what we want to do. What's your ideas?
Sure. Absolutely. And really the beautiful thing about these kinds of solutions, because if you think of this LLC as like a big wad of silly putty that we can mold into so many different ways, we can do all kinds of fun things with them to make sure that we can achieve your goals. And they're a very, very flexible system. And so if the two partners or however many partners agree, we can make it happen. One other thing we have to think about with partnerships is that, back in the 1930s, there was this problem with a lot of people selling phony investments. And so the government now considers any kind of passive investment as a security that the federal government gets to regulate. And Iowa decided, well, we want to in on that too. And so if we deal with passive investor situations, then we do have a few hoops to jump through. And so I said partnerships should have a lawyer involved, passive investors more so. You want to make sure your boxes are checked, because the laws are pretty strict. Um, we talked about those NFTs earlier and cryptocurrencies. I've been surprised at how fast both the IRS and the SEC have been at figuring out how to regulate these things. Most of the government moves pretty slow, but those two branches of the government tend to figure things out pretty quick, unless they're trying to give you money back. They're kind of slow about that.
Right. And so the securities, first thing that comes to my mind is like the syndication word. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, and so that word, it doesn't have as much precision as I would like, and also too, it is kind of niche. And this idea of the securities law coming into play, the way the laws are written, it's very, very broadly interpreted, very broadly. And so that's why if you're basically doing anything where you've got one person making money from someone else's efforts, then you might be dealing with what the government calls a security. And so yes, syndications are what the REI community refers to. You probably want to talk to someone like me if you're thinking about that.
Just having investor conversations, I would venture to guess that happens way more than anyone realizes.
It does. It does.
Okay.
And it's only really a problem if somebody gripes, right? Because there's a lot of handshake deals, or even if they're not a handshake, they're in writing, and 9 times out of 10, they go off without a hitch. But if somebody gripes, then guess what? You got a problem, and it would be better to deal with it at the beginning. It does not take that much work for me to set you on the right course at the beginning. And even if you never need it, it's peace of mind. And then if something does happen later on, then you're ready, you're prepared.
So it's not like you have to just say, we can't do the passive investing investor world. You just have to check the right boxes. It isn't like you have to go do, extra file, because I've heard syndication, just record keeping filing is very extensive. Is that right? Obviously we don't need legal advice here, but in general, it's doable. You just have to do a few more hoops.
We do like to see good record keeping when we have more complex structures. And so I think that is a good rule of thumb. A lot of people say, why do I have to fill out this form every year? Well, if it's just you and your lawn care business, it's really not that big of a deal. But as soon as you start to have problems with accountability and trust, that record keeping is nice, because then you've got a documentation. Just like back to our conversation about contractors, if you're hiring a contractor, you want it in writing. This is what you're going to do. This is how much you're going to charge me. The LLCs, the syndicates, and everything, the partners, they're just going to want to make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's.
Cool. Okay. Is there anything else?
Well, so you said partnerships. What's the big deal? We have unlimited liability problems if we don't do it right. It's pretty easy to do it right. It does make your taxes slightly more complex. Not that big of a deal. It doesn't have to be that big of a deal. One thing that people don't think about is that the owners of an LLC can be LLCs. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll set up holding companies for people where their ABC LLC company owns ABC1 and ABC2 and ABC3 and these other properties. That way, for example, if you've got maybe 8 multi-unit properties that have 5 or 10 units in them, each one of those is a big enough asset that if one goes wrong, you would hate for that to trickle over and hit some of your other assets. So we'll compartmentalize those into separate LLCs. So LLC partnerships, one or more partners can be other businesses. Getting things in writing when you have more complex structures is a big deal. But even with simple LLCs, we can word the operating agreement to make it much more real estate investor friendly. I think it's worth real estate investors' time to get a lawyer involved. And we really don't charge that much. And I do mostly flat fees. So you can just call me, how much is it going to cost? And I'll tell you.
Yeah. No, it's something that I have hired an attorney for. Whenever I'm in question, in my mind, I want to sleep at night. So I'm going to hire one. Let's get it done. Let's get it right, recorded correctly, off and running. So.
Well, one of my takeaways that hopefully your viewers get out of this is that one of your most valuable relationships is also your insurance agent. So if you haven't interviewed one of those yet, do that. And I'll tell you that my policy is make sure your insurance agent understands what you're doing, because they'll really help you sleep well at night. But then after you call the insurance agent, then call a lawyer.
You don't want Geico covering a 10-unit apartment building?
There's times when saving a buck or two is a really nice deal, but if you have a tenant situation that just blows up on you, you got someone in the hospital with a neck injury, which happened to one of my clients. You want to make sure that this is a person you can sit down across from and answer who can answer your questions, not a call center.
Yeah, I would agree. Cool. Okay, we'll step into the tenant landlord kind of, and let's get real specific on what are the tenant pro Iowa tenant laws, pro Iowa landlord laws. If you're investing in Iowa, like what is the 101 you should think about? Because I do work with a lot of out-of-state investors that ask, is Iowa landlord friendly? It's on, on the list of top 20 states, but what is it? How does it work?
Sure. I might need some more specific questions on that, but I will say this, that Iowa is landlord friendly. I went to law school in Minnesota, and I spent a fair amount of time studying landlord tenant law there. And I knew I was going to practice in Iowa, so my professor allowed me to study Iowa law. And it was really, really fascinating comparing Iowa and its northern neighbor, Minnesota. Minnesota is far, far more tenant friendly. And then when you go over to the West Coast, like Oregon, for example, it's just outrageously more tenant friendly.
Yep. Okay, so more specific question would be, we'll start 101. When you're trying to get a new tenant, when you're putting together a new lease and you've not hired out property management, give me the biggest mistake you see, and then we'll do that question, and we'll do, as a tenant in place, what's the biggest mistake landlords make working with that tenant, and then when you have an unruly tenant, what's best practice to part ways in your opinion? So start with, trying to find a tenant. What's 101 biggest mistake or things to avoid?
Well, your biggest mistake is not going to be having a good rental agreement. And so, let's just get that out of the way. You need a good rental agreement, and don't piece together bits and pieces from around. Use something that has been written by a lawyer in the area who knows what it's talking about.
And I'm going to step in here because we just touted earlier in the call about just Bigger Pockets and how great it is. Bigger Pockets does have a form on there. I've not used it, but, and I don't know if you have an opinion on it. Even though I knew that was available, I went to an attorney and had them draft up a rental agreement when I got my first tenant. So,
well, I do a fair number of evictions, and I've worked with a lot of clients in Iowa. And so I've gotten to look at a lot of leases. And what happens is if I see something I like, I pick it out and put it in mine so that I have a template. And I bet I'm cheaper even than Bigger Pockets. Maybe I need to raise my price, but I have a good lease. So that's just me selling my own services there.
Yeah, and that's the reason I have people on, is because I want them to get business from this too. Obviously, being an hour onto this call, someone's going to figure out whether they believe you or not. And if they do, I want them to use you. I think it's going to benefit. So absolutely tout your services if you're proud of it.
But back to, your first mistakes, make sure you've got a lease. Even if it's a family member, have a lease. Make sure that people know what kind of term you're looking at, because by default, if you don't have a rule that says otherwise, you're month to month. And a lot of people think, well, I can just X or I can just Y. But the laws do tend to be, even in Iowa, that is a landlord friendly state, they do tend to be protective of the tenant. And the reason why is landlords typically have money and tenants typically do not. So the law gives them extra protection there. So make sure that your lease talks about the proper term, make sure the rules are clearly spelled out. But then here is where I really want to put my big exclamation mark. And that is, stay away from discriminatory actions. And this is easiest to do if you have your policies in place before you start looking at tenants. And so put them in your lease. Here's the rules, here's what not, put it in your lease, and then just steer clear of things that are discriminatory. And Iowa does actually broaden the kinds of discrimination that are protected. So some states, they don't protect against sexual orientation. Iowa does. But obviously, say, well, we're looking for a good Christian family to, that won't work. That's discrimination. Don't put it in your job description. There are people out there scouring the web for people to find violations for. And these kinds of things tend to be public and you're easy to spot. So just make sure your policies on what it takes to get a rental application successful are clear. And do you recommend a service for people doing background checks on new tenants?
I've in the past used apartments.com, and they have a background check. I hired out all my property management January 1 of this year. So because of the just the potential of discriminatory, even if I didn't do it, that's what they all say. I get sued. I would rather someone else have to like be the front man and deal with that. So
Yep, I think that's a good policy. I used them as well back before when they were called Cozy.
yep.
And I love their service. I've heard it's not as good as it used to be, but that's a really good way to do it. And it's very, very cheap for landlords. The tenant actually pays the application fee and you get a background check. But what are you going to do if you've got somebody that has a pot conviction on their record? Are you going to say no, or are you going to say fine? You just want to know the answers to these questions beforehand. What if they've got a couple of non-payments on their history, but they're more than a year old? What if they're less than a year old? What are you going to do about that? What kinds of pets are allowed or not allowed? Are you going to allow smoking? Kind of answer these questions beforehand.
Yep. And so is that something that you put in the like say Zillow or Facebook ad?
Well,
like,
pet policy, definitely.
yes.
Smoking and non-smoking policy, definitely. Whether or not a felony conviction will disqualify you or not, there's talk about in Iowa making that not okay to have a felony box on your application, but right now I believe it is okay. I wouldn't put that unless you want to just weed out some applicants. I would say let your application process weed those out.
Right. So then they would apply, or they would apply, and then those are the questions that you would ask, and you would say, these things are non-qualifiers.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. And I don't know how a lot of the people that you work with do it, but I used to have a couple disqualifiers before they entered a credit card. And that way they didn't have to pay for the background check.
Yep.
if they knew they were going to be disqualified.
I had probably 50-50 of my investors and clients that manage their own and or hire property manager, but I would agree of just pre-qualified. And also just you don't want to show properties to people that are not qualified.
That's right.
Right. I mean, it's more time saving to the landlord than it is anything. But I was just curious where in that process the line of disqualifications kind of typically goes.
Yeah, because if you accept pets, you're going to stand out because most places don't. And so you want to just make that clear, because some people they're just searching for a place that allows them to have their 40-pound dog or whatever. And so you want to just eliminate or attract the people that you're catering to.
Perfect. Okay, on to tenants currently in place. What typical landlord tenant issues come up if the landlord doesn't want them out, but does anything come up when that in those cases?
Yeah, so some of the things that are oddities about Iowa, and I wouldn't say they're odd, they're specifics, I should say, is what happens if something breaks in the place. And what the tenant has to do is notify the landlord in writing if they've got a problem. And then if the landlord doesn't respond, then what the tenant can do is, if it's less than 1 month's rent, they can just fix it and deduct it from their rent. And the landlord basically has to be okay with that. I would strongly urge landlords to be responsive. But I've seen landlords come to me and say, oh, they had a problem with the furnace and it was December 21st and I couldn't get there fast enough. And so they hired somebody and they took $250 out of the rent. What should I do? And I said, be glad that you didn't have to do it. Just say okay and move on with it. Right. That's what it's supposed to happen. If somebody doesn't have their heat in the wintertime, the law is going to cover them. And so that's probably one of the main things that I see is, what to do about repairs. Well, what happens if there's a really big problem with the house and part or all of the house is not livable? Then what? You just need to have a conversation with your tenant probably. But I've seen tenants come to me and say, I want my landlord to give me free rent or whatever. Here's what Iowa law allows tenants in these situations where the landlord can't fix the problem and the house is unlivable. You have one remedy, one option, and that is to terminate your lease without penalty. That's what Iowa gives tenants. Tenants don't like that because renting a new house is hard, but that's what happens. Yeah, so this is one of the things that makes Iowa landlord friendly, because that's the only remedy they get. Now, I'm not going to say that there's never any other options, but
that the landlord could take if they wanted to.
No, that the tenant could take.
Okay.
The tenant's main remedy is to terminate the lease early, which is a lose-lose solution, right? But usually when landlords come in with problems with existing tenants, it's going to be something about repairs. Or for example, let's say that the landlord says, well, we need to do a major project and the house is going to be hard to live in during this project. And so usually what we need to do is look at your lease and make sure that your lease, if it's quiet on this matter, then we'll have to go look at some other examples. But if your lease has a clause in there, then you guys can work it out. But that's the kind of thing where you might need to come to a lawyer, is what to do about these processes. Usually it's best for everyone to try to work out a system so that they can stay in the house, and you can work around them. And then do the bigger repairs when they move out. And so you do a non-renewal. That's probably one of the bigger issues. What happens if a tenant knows that they're not gonna be able to afford their rent soon? Then what happens? Well, if they just abandon the place, the landlord kind of wins, right? Because they can still charge them rent until they find a new renter. They do have to work to find a new renter, but if it takes them a month and a half, they can collect rent in that period of time. But guess what? The tenant's not going to pay it. And what are you going to do? Sue someone who can barely afford, who can't afford their rent? So you're going to get nothing from them. And so in these situations, I tell landlords and tenants, talk, work it out. If you got a tenant that they're telling you, I don't know what to do, I can't pay my rent, help them get rental assistance if possible, help them get out of their lease early if that's what needs to be done, help make it go easy. Don't be a jerk, right? That doesn't help anyone. And yeah, the landlord might be right. Yeah, your lease is until October. Suck it up, buttercup, right? How does that help anyone? It doesn't.
Yeah, it comes back to sleeping at night for the landlord, right? It's something I always think about, is just like, what do you really want to spend your time complaining about and brain power on? Like, you're an investor and you are usually a pretty smart person. Your brain could be used in other ways aside from trying to argue with a tenant.
The law loves it when people negotiate solutions outside of court.
Yeah.
If you say, well, I have this right and I can go to court for it, but can we pause that so we can negotiate? The court's gonna be like, yes, do so, negotiate it. And so, you as landlord and tenant have great freedom to negotiate solutions that put people in the best possible solution coming out of it. And if you need me to put something in writing, I will.
It's good to hear an attorney say that is a good option, as opposed to just like, let's go to court.
Yeah, right. They say that the only one that wins in court is the lawyers, and that's true. And sometimes we don't win either.
Cool. Okay, so middle. Is that you good there?
Yeah, let's talk about evictions now.
Yeah, evictions.
Yeah.
No, before we got in this call, you're like, I just got done at a court, because you go to court quite often, right? I mean,
yeah, I'm gonna say I'm there once a week, and so they know me on a first name basis now, down in Polk County at least.
Yep.
The evictions in Polk County are tricky. You have to go by the book. It is getting to the point now where most DIY evictions fail. And the problem is that it is very difficult to do everything right when you are a small landlord. And so the process for serving papers has to be followed precisely. And if you mess it up, you can guarantee the legal aid people are going to get your case thrown out. I've been there and I've seen people, with their head low, they're a landlord. You can tell they got a big, thick packet of papers. And I asked them what's going on, and they said, this is the third time, and they threw it out again. And I'm not trying to sell my services here. I'm just telling you it's a sad, sad state of the situation.
And throwing it out means they said, nope, you don't have a leg to stand on. Tenant gets to stay, start the process over.
Bingo.
Which means less rent paid, no rent paid.
Yep. Yep. Now, landlords can get a judgment for back rents, but again, you can't squeeze blood from a rock. So there's four main reasons to evict. So there's clear and present danger. And now that means the police just knocked down the door. I had a landlord that I'm sure you and I both know call me and say, Matt, the DEA was just here and now the door's off the hinges. And so clear and present danger is an easy one to succeed on. And oftentimes the person can't show up in court because they're in jail. There is a big gotcha though. If there's a situation of domestic abuse, then the abuse victim, if they have some documentation, and it doesn't take much, they do get some extra protections. But those are really sad situations.
Essentially, you mean when you say extra, like rights to the property?
Yes. Yep. So it's going to be a little bit harder to evict the victim of domestic abuse, than it would be to evict a person who's running a drug business out of their house.
Okay.
The next reason would be non-payment. And so that also tends to be a relatively straightforward process. That means that the tenant is supposed to pay rent and they didn't. And so if your lease says rent's due on the 5th, it's late on the 6th, or it's due on the 1st, but after the 5th, then it's late. Usually around that time, you're going to want to serve notice to the tenant that they got to pay or get out. And the longer you wait, the harder it is I mean, it just takes longer. I usually suggest to landlords be strict. Every time someone's late, serve them a notice in writing.
It sounds, so I've been there. I have a property, and it seems like this one unit, for whatever reason, gets these tenants. And
I've heard that story elsewhere.
I didn't realize that it's like serving paperwork. It's like once it's drafted up, the attorney puts it together. It's not a real expensive process. I mean, and it's the thing that needs to be done. One, it gets the tenants' attention, like, because it's a big deal, and they either have never had it done and they're like, oh shit, this really matters. Or two, they've had it done and like, oh, this really matters because I know the last time this happened, it mattered.
Yeah.
So,
well, here's the situation. If you serve them written notice, then you have the freedom to begin the eviction process, whatever the set time is after that. If you don't serve them papers, then you have to wait until you do, and then you get the time period. But if you serve papers, you do not have to start the eviction process when that clock stops ticking. If you want to work out something, you can, but at least you've got the documentation so that if you're like, all right, this isn't working, then you've already done step one and you can move on to step two without delay. So I just say, and this kind of goes back to also the discrimination thing. Don't treat different people differently. If you're late, you get a written notice, done. If you want to work out something, fine. You want to negotiate, fine. That's your choice as a landlord or as a tenant. Go for it. But if they're late, send them the notice.
Is there any way to automate that?
There are tools, and I wouldn't be surprised if apartments.com might have tools to do that. I'm sorry that I don't know. I know that some of the bigger landlords do have systems in place to simplify the process. I don't know what your typical 3 to 5 unit landlord's going to do.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, that was 2, right? So we're at
number 3 is lease violations. And so if somebody's smoking in the house and you keep telling them not to, or they got a dog in the house and they're not supposed to, or they're, maybe they're modifying the house and they're not supposed to do that. That's a lease violation. You can evict for that reason. And people do get a little bit longer time period to fix whatever the problem is. But you still got to give them the notice in writing, hey, you're not supposed to, and you are, fix it. But once the process happens, then the eviction is the same in the end. It's about the same process.
So longer time frame, just for those out of state and trying to understand what is long. I mean, are we 14 days or are we 90 days? What is it?
Yeah, good point. So non-payment is 3 days, but sometimes it's 4 more days. Lease violation is 7 days. How many fingers up? But sometimes it's 4 more days.
Okay.
So not very long periods of time compared to some states.
Good. That gives good perspective.
And then the 4th reason to evict is holdover tenants. And so you terminated a lease or whatever, and you did it properly, and they're still there. Or you bought the house, and guess what? The homeowner didn't move out, but it's in your name. Now what? So you got a holdover tenant, and then what do you do about that? So that you can evict for that reason as well. Those are the 4 main reasons.
And when you say holdover, I just want to make real clear here, that's without a lease.
Yep.
Because if they have a lease, when it's something that a lot of investors, first-time investors, don't realize, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you buy a property, you're buying the lease that's in place.
That's a great point. So if you are buying property with renters, then you're going to have had a lawyer involved in that process. That's not something that DIY should be done by itself, right? You're going to need assignments of lease and such like that. You are still bound by those leases, absolutely. But no, in this case, what we're talking about with holdover leases is the lease is expired, or for whatever reason, there's no valid lease in place, and they're still there.
Non-renewed, if the landlord non-renewed it,
yep.
And they mysteriously are still there type thing.
That would be the number 1 case, is a non-renewal. Yep.
Cool. Awesome. I mean, I think this conversation has been good. It's been an hour plus. I apologize for taking more of your time than I was expecting. But yeah, obviously we could dig into any one of these topics and do an entire hour-long episode on them specifically. So we'll wrap this up. I appreciate your time. Tell anyone listening to this, watching this, where and how would be the best way to do business with you, and or what exactly are you looking for in an ideal client?
Sure. My ideal client is someone who is concerned about business risk. And so if that describes you, like I want to know, how does this LLC help me avoid problems, or what do I do because I have this situation and I want to avoid it getting worse or whatever. Risk management, risk understanding is what I love to do. And so if that sounds like you, and we're talking about business, that's good. You can find me on the web at iowabusinesslawyer.com. So I try to make it real easy. And that way, if people ask me, do you do divorces? I can say iowabusinesslawyer.com, because no, I don't do divorces. And you can go right on there and you can see my calendar and you can schedule time with me, or, whatever. I do a lot of meetings with Zoom or on the phone. Maybe 20% of my clients come meet me in the office, but I'm open late on Mondays. So if someone's got a day job and they need to meet, we can meet Monday evenings at 6:30 if you want to. So I'm gonna try to make it real easy for busy people to connect with me.
Cool. Yeah. And we'll have your links and information below in the podcast and in the YouTube channel. So we'll have links direct and I'll go straight to your either calendar or your website.